The story of Jesus in the Gospels, in the Scriptures, is mostly taken place, at least in his public ministry, mostly taken place around the Sea of Galilee. And as I said earlier on, the Sea of Galilee, it hasn't changed much. I mean, there have been earthquakes, and that means that the shape has shifted a little bit here and a little bit there. If you stand on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, you're still going to see the Golden Heights, and there aren't many high-rise buildings and so on. So it is the way that, almost exactly the way that Jesus left it. This is the theater of Jesus' public ministry. A very, very small area. Most of it took place in an area that is smaller than northern Johannesburg. That's how small it all was. But so many great things were happening there. We know, of course, in Capernaum, great things were happening. Jesus was in the synagogue. He was driving the devil out of the possessed man. He was making healings. He was preaching in the synagogue. And when we talk about a synagogue in the first century, in Jesus' time, we're not talking about the church. We are talking about a community center. Actually, a little bit like this. A hall and a place for scriptural readings and so on. People who would be there would be called rabbis, the teachers, the masters, as Jesus was called in the Scriptures, rabbi. And those weren't clerics. And it wasn't like we have priests now or rabbis in the Jewish faith. Everybody who was teaching was a rabbi in those days. So Rabbi Jesus, or Rabboni Jesus, was preaching in that synagogue. And that synagogue doesn't exist anymore. There is a 4th century synagogue that stands there now. But it is built on top of an older synagogue. And one can still see the basalt foundation of that synagogue. And that, archaeology has proven, is the foundation of the synagogue in which Jesus preached, in which he performed miracles, in which he drove the devil out of that possessed man. So here we have got, again, the place where we can find the physical Jesus. Jesus was at that place. Just 25 meters away from that, St. Peter had his house, or Peter's mother-in-law. There was a house where Peter stayed. And we, of course, read in the Scriptures that lots of miracles happen in that place. We find in the Scriptures that Jesus healed the mother-in-law of Peter. We hear about the crowds gathering outside that house in order to see this miracle work in Jesus. And that house still exists. Not quite as you would imagine a house to exist, but the house is still there. It has been discovered in the 1960s. Let's start back a little bit further still. Capernaum was covered by sand for centuries. It was a lost city. It was abandoned after an earthquake in, I think, the 9th century. In the 19th century, people were starting to discover the synagogue I was talking about, the 4th century synagogue. In the 1960s, Franciscan archaeologist by the name of Father Vigilio Corbo, with an assistant by the name of Father Stanislao Lafreda, started excavating Capernaum. And one thing that they found was a church in the shape of an octagon. And they dug it out. And they found that the description coincided exactly with one given by a pilgrim in the late 6th century, the pilgrim from Piacenza. Nobody really knows his name. People think it might be Antonio. And he had described that church. And it was exactly as he described it. So they dug a little bit further. And then they found that that place used to be a house church. Now, a house church, as I mentioned earlier on, is what the Christians were using to get together before they were allowed to build churches in the Roman Empire. So they found that this place had been a house church. And they found graffiti. And the graffiti was written in Greek, which was the lingua franca of the region at the time. It was written in Syriac, which is more or less like Aramaic, the language that Jesus would have spoken at the time, and Hebrew. That is very important. Hebrew used to be the language, or is the language of Judaism. It was also the language, of course, of the very, very first Christians, who were Jews. So that graffiti goes back right to the beginning. So Father Corbo and Father Lafreda, they dug a little bit further, and they found various appliances. Layer by layer, they found appliances. And they found little gas lamps. And the next layers revealed more gas lamps. And then the next layers started to reveal household products. Things that you would use in the house. Bowls and dishes and plates and so on. What does it tell us? It tells us that In this house, first, people were living, a domestic quarter. People were living in this house because that's why you have household products. Then suddenly there are no more household products, it's gas lamps. It means that by now, this place was not being used as a domestic abode anymore, it was being used as a place of gathering. It was being used as a church. And that description of the early house church coincides with a very, very valuable document that exists, written by a Spanish woman by the name of Egeria, who came to the Holy Land in about 390. And she described it exactly the way that the Franciscan Fathers found it in the 1960s. So we can be absolutely certain that this was Peter's house. This was the house that Jesus performed miracles in. And then they found something else. The architecture of the house means that you could not have a proper roof. The roof would have to be very, very light, otherwise the walls won't hold it. It would be made out of straw and mud. It would be a roof that you can remove. Now cast your mind back to the scripture. What happened when those two guys came with a friend and they couldn't get through the front door? They climbed up and they removed the roof in order to lower him into the house so that Jesus can perform a miracle. So here we have archaeology telling us the story that we find in Scripture. And we find that quite often in the Holy Land, that archaeology confirms things that we saw in Scripture. Just as a very, very quick aside, you know the story of the pools of Bethesda, where Jesus healed the man who couldn't get into the healing water and told him, now get up. That was at the pools of Bethesda. For centuries, Scripture scholars thought that because of the way that St. John had described it in the Gospel, it was a metaphor. Even Christian Bible scholars thought that the story was metaphorical. And then it was dug up. And what the archaeologists find, that it looked exactly the way that St. John had described it. So archaeology is proving over and over again that what we read in Scriptures, New Testament and even in the Old Testament, is correct.